Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can I welcome you to this meeting of the Global Strategy Forum? The welcome is both to those of us who are, but there are also an unknown but significant number of people watching virtually and who will be able to take part in the proceedings. Could I in particular welcome Gideon Rachman, our speaker, and also Michael Lothian, the chairman of Global Strategy Forum. I've been asked to, just before we go into the main substance, just to make a couple of housekeeping points, as it were. The first is that the next event will be co-hosted with the Oxford Media Network and will take place on Wednesday, the 11th of May. Its subject will be the negotiators, those in the shadows. And it's looking at the Middle East peace process and how it developed in a rather private way. One of the participants will be Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's former chief of staff, and the event will be chaired by Tom Tugendhat, the chair of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee. It will also be a hybrid event like today. A couple of words about the format of today, given the hybrid nature of this meeting. That means that for those who are attending the event online via Zoom, the webinar is viewing only, as I think you know, so it's not possible for those watching us remotely to speak, but they can contribute. And if you'd like to do so, you do so by submitting your question in writing through the Q&A function, which will appear, I hope, on your laptop, and the questions will appear on the screen, which I can see in front of me. I will curate these questions, and there will also be a microphone for those of you who are present today. So if I call upon you to ask your question, a microphone should be brought to you. I've been asked to say we will be recording the event, and we'll be making the recording available online as soon as possible, and it will be available via your YouTube channel. And those who use Twitter will also, subject to Mr. Elon Musk's permission, ought to be able to also see the recorded version. So enough of that. We now come to the main purpose why we're here, and it's my very great pleasure to invite Gideon Rachman, who is the Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent of the Financial Times, who will be well known to many of you, and he and I have known each other for a good number of years. For those of you who are not aware, Gideon has not only been with the FT for a long time, but he won the Orwell Prize for Journalism in 2016 and was also named the Commentator of the Year in the European Press Prize Awards several years ago. He's written 3 books on international politics, and it's the third, the most recent one, The Age of the Strongman, which some of you may already have seen. There are copies over there if anyone wishes to buy at the end of the proceedings. And so the theme today will be this particular book and the points raised by Gideon. When he has finished his opening remarks, which will be for around 15 minutes, he and I will be in conversation for a further 15 minutes, and then the rest of the proceedings will be open to questions and comments from the floor, both in person and virtually. And we are required and will finish at no later than 2 p.m. So Gideon, over to you, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Global Strategy Forum.
Thank you, Malcolm, and thanks to the Global Strategy Forum for having me, and to Jacqueline for organising this. She always does so well. I've sat in the audience, so I feel I owe it to you to do my turn, and thank you for inviting me. So I thought in my 15 minutes I'd try and answer 3, possibly 4 questions. The sort of classic journalistic questions: what do you mean by the Age of the Strongman? When did it happen? Why did it happen? And then maybe, if we've got time, a bit of, well, what happens now? So one of the sort of conceptual problems I had to deal with trying to write a book like this is it really possible to yoke together all the different leaders that I have under one banner, this strongman characteristic? Because you have people like Xi Jinping, who's operating in a entirely authoritarian, undemocratic system. Then you have others like Donald Trump, who's an elected leader, and a range in between. Can you really say that there is a single type? And I think that I find it surprisingly, slightly disconcertingly easy to see links between leaders in the democratic world and the undemocratic world and the sort of hinterland in between. around the strongman theme. So what do you mean by it? I think central to it is a personality cult around the idea of the strong leader. Trump, in his 2016 speech to the Republican National Convention, says at some point, "I alone can do it." He describes the American carnage and how things are going terribly wrong, and he's the only guy who can fix it. And in different ways, most of these leaders make a similar claim. So that in India, Narendra Modi, Ram Guha, the Indian historian, put it rather well. He said that the message of the Indian state is that India is Modi and Modi is India, to the extent that if you get vaccinated in India, Modi's face is on the vaccination certificate. But then in China too, you'd say that there's also been, interestingly, a move back towards a personality cult. I think one of the things that Deng tried to do after the Mao era was to move China to a more collective style of leadership. They even introduced term limits so that you couldn't have another Mao figure. But what Xi has managed to do is to abolish term limits, and I think, unless things go badly wrong, which they might, given what's happening in COVID, but I wouldn't bet on it, he will have his term extended long into the future this November. But he's also had his thought written into the Chinese constitution in 2017. Again, the first time that's been done since Mao. And you could make similar points about most of these leaders, Bolsonaro, Erdogan, and so on. I think another thing that's very striking about them is that, again, in different contexts, their pitch is similar. They're all what I call nostalgic nationalists. They're leaders who say, this country used to be great, something's gone very badly wrong, and I'm the person who can bring it back again. So again, archetypally, Trump is make America great again. But Xi Jinping's pitch is the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people, and central to the whole narrative of the Chinese Communist Party is that the century of humiliation that begins with Britain and the Opium Wars, and then in their telling ends with the triumph of the Communist Party, and that the completion of Xi's task is the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people. Again, Erdogan, there is a sense that he's going to bring Turkey, there's what they call neo-Ottomanism, that Turkey could look back to the great days of the Ottoman Empire and once again be a great global power. Modi, similarly, there's a Hindu revivalism there which says it's not just the British Empire we need to get beyond, but even the Mughal Empire, the Islamic influence on India, and that Hindus, in the rhetoric of some in the BJP, have been oppressed for hundreds of years, but now's their chance to turn that around. So it's a rhetoric. I don't think it's a coincidence that they all go for this, because I think to create the argument that you need a strongman figure, you need to create a sense of national crisis and also a sense that there's a rejuvenation out there possible if you're just prepared to take the necessary steps. And I think that leads to a third common characteristic, is that, again, admittedly in different institutional settings, but because they're all rule breakers, they're all people who say, we can't afford to play by the institutional setup that's constraining us at the moment. The crisis is too big, and in fact, the institutions are a product of our enemies, either internal enemies or external enemies, who are using them to constrain us from taking the necessary action. And I alone can do it. I can break through it. So this leads ultimately to Trump trying to overturn the result of an American presidential election. But you have Erdogan in Turkey using an attempted coup, admittedly, to declare a state of emergency and arrest all sorts of people. In fact, I feel quite strongly about that today, because a close friend of mine has just been imprisoned for 18 years yesterday on crazy trumped-up charges. So, again, these are people who revel in the idea of a state of emergency that justifies extreme action, breaking the rules. And then Yeah, so that's the what. Let me go to the when then. I think that it starts almost too neatly on the 31st of December 1999, the dawn of a new century, new millennium, when Putin comes to power in the Kremlin. And initially, he speaks the language of democracy, actually, after there's an election in March, and he says, we're showing that Russia can have all the good things of a modern democratic state. And Bill Clinton, who is in Moscow around the time, similarly greets him as the man who's going to modernize Russia, turn it into a democracy. And it's not totally surprising that is the language that even Putin is speaking then, because around that is the sort of moment of maximum Western power. It's a decade after the fall of the Berlin Wall. There doesn't really seem to be any alternative in town. But I think over the course of 20 years, Putin changes his colors, and he attracts a lot of admirers around the world, some of whom directly emulate him. It becomes apparent, well, for those who are looking in retrospect, quite early on, that Putin is not the Democrat that he claims to be. There's the Chechen War, the expulsion of people like Khodorkovsky, expropriation of Yukos, and so on. But he explicitly breaks with the Western consensus in 2007 with a big speech in Munich. In 2008, there's the Georgian War, by which time we probably should have noticed something was up. But even then, Angela Merkel, I think, sums up a common view when she says, well, he's a 19th century figure in the 21st century. In other words, he's a man out of his time. We don't need to worry about him that much because he's an anomaly. But I think it becomes apparent he's not an anomaly, and I'll run through briefly the chronology. In 2003, Erdogan comes in Turkey. Similar sort of reception. Initially in the West, we see him as a sort of democratic reformer, the man who's going to reconcile Islam and democracy. It's all marvelous. Becomes clear that actually it's not by 2011. A lot of these very oppressive tendencies are emerging. 2012, Xi comes to power in China, and I've explained how he breaks with the efforts to move towards a more collective leadership. 2014, Modi in India, again, a process of democratic erosion sets in quite quickly. 2016, you have Trump and Brexit, and I actually include Boris Johnson in the book, which I knew would be controversial. Perhaps we can discuss that in the question and answer. I think he exhibits some of the characteristics of this. 2017, Mohammed bin Salman establishes himself as the crown prince and really the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. And again, it's an example of how, even in a system that seems, it's obviously got nothing to do with Western democracies, but there is a creation of a personality cult, a move away from a more personalized, from a more collective style of leadership, and indeed embrace of violence, the murder of Khashoggi and so on, and the war in Yemen. 2018, Bolsonaro in Brazil. 2019, actually, Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia is an interesting figure because he's a classic. He comes in, is hailed as a liberal reformer, is even given the Nobel Peace Prize, and then shortly afterwards, it turns out it's a bit more complicated than that, and launches a really vicious war in Tigray. So that's the kind of sorry story, and I think although it sounds like a collection of anecdotes, it collectively, if you look at, say, the kind of things that Freedom House put out, you can see that there is an erosion of democracy around the world. They call it now a 17-year democratic recession. They chart political liberties around the world, and it's been going backwards for the best part of a generation now. Why? Again, maybe say some of it for the question and answer. It's obviously a difficult question to answer. It varies in different areas. I'd point to two main things. The easy one, and the one that we all point to, is economics, inequality, and so on. And it is clear that certainly in the West, Trump appeals, for example, to people. He says at some point, we love the poorly educated. And the reason is that not having a college degree is a very strong indicator, both of a Trump vote, but also having done very badly economically in the previous 20, 30 years. And Angus Dayton, the economist, charts what he calls deaths of despair, where the life expectancy of people in that demographic actually begins to fall in the United States in a way you would not expect in an advanced society, and which was similar to some of the life expectancies falls you saw in Russia in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So something was going badly wrong. And that is a story not just confined to the United States. But I think there's also a cultural element often linked to migration, cultural fear, that the rhetoric of a lot of these leaders is that they're majoritarians and that the status of the majority is threatened. So that, again, in the US, a background fear to a lot of this is the idea that America is going to become majority-minority by 2045, that whites will no longer be more than 50% of the population. But you see it, say, Viktor Orban in Hungary, his great moment in 2015, when he sort of becomes a global figure, is when he says, if we allow this kind of migration, it will be the end of the Hungarian nation. Similarly, Marine Le Pen, who's obviously just lost and would have been the first female strong woman, very much ran on migration. In India, again, Modi, even though Hindus are 80% of the population, there is a great sort of part of the BJP rhetoric is that Muslims are outbreeding Hindus and this is a danger to the nation. So I would, if I had to choose two, I would pick the economics and the fear of migration or the majorities of losing entrenched positions. And it's when you link those two that I think it becomes particularly powerful as an appeal for a strongman figure, because they will say, this is the national emergency, the nation is being submerged by outsiders, you are suffering economically, the whole system has allowed this to happen, and I'm the guy, the strongman, who will break the rules to restore us, make us great again. And that, I think, is very broadly what's going on. And collectively, it amounts to a sort of sustained assault on what we've called the liberal world order and a lot of the rules that have governed it since the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, Gideon. Please. You've raised some fascinating issues and presented them very clearly, both in your book and what you've said just now. Let me perhaps just put 2 or 3 questions to you to try and clarify some of the points that I found particularly challenging. At the very beginning of your book, you say, and you've mentioned it just now, that the strongmen are typically nationalists and cultural conservatives. So the question I want to put to you is, are they nationalists and cultural conservatives because that's what they believe in, or because that's what helps them persuade people to vote for them? Which way around? I know it may vary from individual to individual, but is this just a coincidence, or is there a fundamental link between the national ethos, cultural conservatism, as opposed to strong views on other social values?
I think it's usually would be a mixture of opportunism and conviction. I mean, an interesting case is Viktor Orban, who emerges in 1989 as a liberal and as an opponent of Soviet rule. And I remember when I first went to Hungary, I was still under the impression that he was this sort of liberal hero, and I had to be disabused.
Isn't that, though, because we failed to make a distinction between being liberal and democratic? He says he is an illiberal Democrat.
Absolutely.
And he may have always been one.
I'm not sure how democratic he is.
Well, he was elected.
He was,
by popular
although
vote.
The opposition candidate, you know how long he got on state television?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, yeah. In 3 months. So it's a slightly funny election. But anyway, I think Orban, when he loses an election early on, he then has a period out of power, and he sort of reinvents himself as a cultural conservative and a nationalist. But I have no reason to believe that he doesn't believe a lot of that stuff.
Let me take this forward a bit.
Yep.
You also say that strongmen are characteristically anti-globalist.
Yeah.
Now, again, I come to the question, is that a necessary part of being a strongman? Is it because they're afraid that internationalism will inevitably mean global rules, which they will be forced to accept, international courts, which they might, human rights issues and things of that kind? Or is there something about the strongman psychology that makes them want to reject global values?
Well, it depends what you mean. Globalism is a very slippery term, and it tends to be their term. You know, it's a way of saying essentially that there is an elite out there, sometimes in the country, sometimes outside the country, that is not loyal to the nation, that is not working in the nation's interests, and that I'm the person to push them back. I was having a debate actually with colleagues yesterday who were saying, look, you know, not all of these strongmen figures are protectionists. I mean, I think for Xi Jinping, the national interest clearly is not protectionism because China's done so well out of global trade. So he would continue to be a defender of globalization. But I think that they're at least emotionally attracted. They don't have any kind of theoretical, loyalty to free trade if it wasn't. And I think that, I mean, the globalism is, for them, not so much an economic system as you imply. It's a sort of system of rules that is created by a shadow elite. So it's rather striking and rather disturbing that they all, or not all of them, but a great many of them light upon George Soros as the figure that they go after. It starts in the United States, but Turkey, Erdogan takes it up. In fact, the chap I mentioned who has just got 18 years worked for the Soros Foundation. The Russians closed down the Open Society Foundation quite soon. And I think that Soros fits a lot of the cliches. He's a financier, probably doesn't help that he's Jewish. He's international, he's in New York, he's in London, etc. But he's also a big supporter of minority rights. And a lot of the causes that he funds are ones that do not find favor in a majoritarian, authoritarian society.
Before we move on from individuals, there's one other individual whom you touched on, and that is Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
And on page 8 of your book, you say, some British readers will raise an eyebrow at the inclusion of Boris Johnson in the role of strongman leaders.
Yeah.
Now, I think we deserve some explanation as to why you have included him. And, I mean, you were saying a few moments ago, they're typically cultural conservatives. Well, he's not particularly cultural conservative when it comes to liberal values of, in terms of how that's normally defined. And one final point before you answer me. If he's a strongman, what about Margaret Thatcher? Would she have come into that category? And if not, why not? Because I found her pretty strong.
She was most of the definitely. Time. No, but I would say that the difference is that she was a believer in institutions. I don't think she was somebody who would break the law and who I think took that very, very seriously. And I think, as we're seeing now, Boris Johnson is somebody who, to some extent, thinks, look, the rules don't really apply to me, which is a sort of classic strongman pitch that the cause I represent and my own sort of personal charisma mean that, come on, I'm not particularly constrained by that. And I don't think...
That may open up his moral compass, or whether he has one, but why does it make him a strongman?
Okay, so...
Because he's not been able to deliver many of these objectives.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think he is at the edges of it, but I think he does fit into it, so that the core, it's the idea of the nation or the people being frustrated was very much the rhetoric when Brexit was stuck. And when Johnson resigns from the May government, he actually gives an interview in which he says there's a deep state that's frustrating Brexit, which is classic strongman rhetoric, and it was rhetoric borrowed from Donald Trump. Actually, it starts in Turkey, the whole notion of the deep state. And then he also, at one point, I don't think in the same interview, suggests, well, maybe actually we should kind of imitate Trump's way of dealing with foreign countries in our dealings with the EU. He says, there'd be all sorts of mess and so on, but it's a very good thought, that kind of chucking your weight around, and I think tries to do it. And then, of course, when he comes in, he does prorogue Parliament. Now, to his credit, when the Supreme Court overrules him, he doesn't do what Trump would do and say, well, that's illegitimate, I'm not accepting that. So he plays within the rules to an extent, but he's also prepared to play fast and loose with the rules. And many members of your own party found that out. That was a classic strongman thing. Take many of the most established members of your own party and chuck them out within a few days. It's not a... but I think also more broadly, one of the reasons I decided I had to put him in was that when I was outside Britain, I found that people very much paired him with Trump, particularly because the coincidence of the events of 2016, Brexit and Trump were seen as paired events. And so that chapter is in some extent partly about where Brexit fits into this sort of break with the liberal consensus that had prevailed post the Cold War.
Let's move on from the personalities into the broader issues you raise. And you say in your book, and I think you said it in your opening comments, that what we're seeing as a result of these strongmen is the quote I'm referring to is the greatest global assault since the 1930s. Now, that's a pretty powerful statement, because the 1930s is immediately a comparison with Nazi Germany, with fascist Italy, with the Spanish Civil War, and Stalin and the Soviet Union, and so forth. And yet, as you yourself point out in the book, in 1945, there were only 12 democracies in the world.
Yeah.
In 2002, there were 90.
Yeah.
Massive increase. And although there's been some drawing back from that figure, we still have a situation where the whole of Western Europe, as we saw with President Macron's victory a couple of days ago, can be classed as not having succumbed to strongmen. The same is true of, not all, but quite a lot of Latin America, a lot of the Far Eastern countries like South Korea, Japan, and so forth. So aren't you exaggerating a bit to say this is, I mean, it may technically be a greater assault than any we've seen since the 1930s, but is it really that dramatic, or is it just a natural trend of things that you had this huge increase of democracies after the end of communism and after the end of the Soviet Union? There was bound to be some reversal in some individual countries where local circumstances made it difficult for democracy and liberalism to achieve the roots that would make them sustained.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're right to ask me about that, and I did hesitate when I wrote that. I think, is it a bit overdone? But actually, I feel more confident about it because I wrote that before the war in Ukraine. And I think that Putin's war does show that one of the things, I mean, one of the reasons, obviously, one's reluctant or wary of raising the spectre of the 1930s, as we all know how it ended in bloodshed and in war. And, you know, was that a bit hysterical, alarmist? Well, I think that now that you know, we do have the biggest land war in Europe since the Second World War, you can see that the kind of violence that's sort of perhaps inherent in a lot of the language and the rhetorical appeal can actually turn into warfare in the case of Putin. And I think if he wins, which thankfully is looking a little less likely, then I think you might see this accelerate, that China would attack Taiwan, that others would begin to feel that the way to give expression to strongman politics is in fact through warfare.
But isn't the actual recent events we've seen, not just Ukraine, slightly more broadly than that, showing that the idea of concentrating all power in one individual means that when they're right, that's fine, but when they're wrong, the mistakes are dramatically greater.
Yeah.
So you have had Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which so far, from his perspective as well, has been a disastrous series of defeats so far.
Yeah.
We've had Xi Jinping, who thought he had conquered COVID.
Yeah.
And now we find COVID is more rampant in China than anywhere else, and that the strongman approach to it just hasn't worked. We had the Trump assault on the Capitol in the United States, which was part of a reaction to the strongman. So shouldn't we be a little bit more optimistic than you were
Maybe.
suggesting?
Well, I mean, actually, the book, you know, it's not an endorsement of the strongman.
No, I'm not saying you personally.
No, but I mean, to the extent that I did end the book by saying, you know, this is a model that will ultimately fail, and I think I said, you know, point out many of the flaws of strongman rule, particularly the over-centralization of power, the fact that if you don't have checks and balances, they'll make a mistake. And I think the longer they're in power, the more likely they are to make a mistake because megalomania sets in, and I think that's what you've seen with Putin. So certainly, I certainly don't think this is the final form of human government, or that. But I do think, for some reason, there's been a trend towards it for the last 20 years. And I think you're right. It is interesting that Putin has made this terrible mistake around the same time that I think she's in trouble, actually. I mean, I don't know whether, you know, his position is under threat because he's so entrenched. But I think that the thing you point to, COVID is very, very serious. They've locked down Shanghai. You know, it's the largest lockdown in human history. I was talking to someone in Shanghai just the other day, described it as that. There's 25 million people, and if it breaks out of Shanghai into the Yangtze Delta in Beijing, and they have to lock down the whole of China, it's an economic blow. It's a blow to his prestige, and particularly because I think one of the aspects of the strongman rule is that when things are going right, they take credit for everything. And that is what she did. A year after Wuhan, there was a big exhibition in which they contrasted China's success in combating COVID with 1 million dead in the United States, and it was all about the marvelous leadership of Xi Jinping. So it's then rather hard when things start going wrong to say, well, that's nothing to do with me.
One final question from me before we turn to questions from the audience. And it's to do with the internet and the implications of what's happening, particularly in China, but also elsewhere. When the internet was first created, it was seen as a blow to the dictators because they would not have the same control over information and what was happening in their countries, because everyone would be able to find out from the internet. And to a substantial extent, that was true and remains true in many, many parts of the world. But are we in your view, are we going to be facing a possible risk that Orwell and Huxley were right? That Big Brother in China is watching you. The Chinese now have used modern technology so that every single Chinese citizen on his app it's all recorded, what he's doing, how he's doing it,
Absolutely.
and his future employment and social prospects are influenced by that. Now, if that is true already to some degree in China, are not your strongmen dictators going to say, well, that's a great idea. I think we'll do the same in Brazil, we'll do the same in Mexico, we'll do the same in wherever we're talking about. Is that what the world is facing, that particularly because of the strongmen, that they have now the technological possibility, if they can get enough people in their own countries to support them, to actually change the whole future of the human race?
Yeah, I think that you're right. We were too blithely optimistic about the liberating potential of the internet. We only saw that side, and as you say, that side is there. I mean, Navalny's assault on Putin was through YouTube, putting out a video which then millions and millions of people watched. So it can subvert the official discourse, but it also is an incredible surveillance tool. You can't really operate in China without a mobile phone because every purchase is done through your phone. It's all sort of app-based and you scan stuff and so on. But if you have a mobile phone, you're completely traceable. They can know where you are at all times, what your habits are, and so on. It's just a sort of slightly odd sideline, but apparently it's now made it virtually impossible for Western intelligence agents to operate in Beijing because people know where they're moving. They know who they are. They know where they're moving. Anyone you meet, they know you've met them. There is no privacy anymore. That is a tool that China can export and is exporting.
So do you think it's possible for other strongmen to emulate Xi Jinping, or is the nature of Chinese society and the control of the Communist Party so much more pervasive than exists in Turkey or in Hungary or in other countries?
Well, I think that there are aspects of it that are specifically Chinese, which is the way in which the Communist Party, as you say, is entrenched in workplaces and so on. But some of this is just technological. It's the ability to monitor people. And you've seen, for example, the Israeli technology, to crack WhatsApp, which they have successfully sold around the world. And there's a market for this stuff. And as far as I can tell, some of the popularity of China with governments in Africa is saying, well, we can help you with this kind of thing.
Thank you very much. Now let us open to questions. There is a microphone that will come to you. Could you please give your name when you begin your question? Now, where's the microphone? There we are. Yes, lady down here. Your name first, please.
My name is Zina Traus of Crivelli Lectures. The question I wanted to ask was that if we are in the age of strong men, why with each passing day does Putin's botched war in Ukraine make him look like a very feeble commander? And will this have a knock-on effect on other strongmen, his prototypes along the globe? And most importantly, how do you see this flawed model of liberal democracy being rolled out in the 21st century?
Well, yes, I hope that it will help to discredit it. I'll put it another way. Had Putin won a very easy victory, I think that his rhetoric and the model that he represents would have gained in prestige all over the world if it rolled into Kiev in 3 days. And in fact, you'd seen this build up really since 2013. The sort of simplified narrative is you have Obama not intervening in Syria in 2013, Then 2014, you get the annexation of Crimea and the outbreak of the war there. 2016, Putin intervenes in Syria. And by then, there's quite a lot of admiration for him. So Nigel Farage, who actually I think is probably the true parallel to Trump in Britain rather than Johnson. But Farage says, when he's asked which politician he most admires in the world, says Putin, because look at the genius of what he's done in Syria. Rudy Giuliani, Trump's lawyer, says the same. That's what you call leadership. And indeed, Trump, just a couple of days before the invasion of Ukraine, calls Putin a strategic genius. And if he had succeeded, the prestige of what he was doing, and there's always this comparison with the West, so that a lot of what Putin was doing was appealing to, what do you want to call them, conservatives, nationalists, whatever, reactionaries in the West, by saying, look how well I'm doing, and look how pathetically you're doing. He, in fact, in an interview with the FT, he said that the liberal democratic ideal is over, he deliberately hits a lot of the themes that are disconcerting conservatives in the West, like trans stuff. In the middle of the Ukraine war, he takes time out to praise J.K. Rowling, who incidentally sort of says, actually, I can do without that. But that's because he's pitching to people who are disconcerted by this in the West, and who might say, well, say what you like about Vladimir Putin, but he's right about that. So I think that, if he fails, then that kind of pitch looks less attractive. And I think it's quite interesting. Max Boot, who's a kind of ex-neocon, writes the Washington Post, wrote quite an interesting piece saying that there was a big, amongst the sort of fan club for Putin, and particularly much more for Orban in the United States, they were saying, well, our military are so pathetic. They're doing all this stuff about gay rights. They're now doing stuff about trans rights. That this is not a military that would actually defend us. Much more, we should be like the Russians, who after all are doing terribly well in Syria. And Boot made the point, well, actually, you can see the consequences of the lack of respect for human rights, the lack of discipline in the Russian army. It's not working that well, and maybe it's better to have a military that tries to stay abreast with contemporary values and that tries to follow the rule of law. And so those kinds of arguments, I think, are taking place around what Putin's doing.
Okay, thank you. We now have a question from one of our virtual participants, from Amitav Banerjee. How much have the strongmen capitalized on a general disenchantment with established political parties and traditional politics, a phenomenon that we continue to witness?
Very much. I think that certainly in the West, that's absolutely key. So that, we're all trying to assimilate what happened in France, and by and large, I think it was a defeat for that kind of politics. But as many people have pointed out, if you put together the votes of Mélenchon and Le Pen, etc., you had over 50% of French people, at least in the first round, voting for radically anti-system, anti-establishment parties. And polling data can reveal quite alarming results. Even in Britain, I think in the book there's a poll where over 50% of people in Britain agreed that we need a strong man who's willing to break the rules to get things done. And in periods of frustration, the pitch that all politicians are the same, they're a self-serving elite. These are familiar tropes, but they gain followers when things are going badly. So that very much is the argument, and that's why these leaders claim a direct relationship with the people. They will say, look, there's this elite, this political elite, which is really not serving the interests of the people, but I will serve the interests of the people. And actually, it's partly why social media comes in. I think social media allows these leaders to establish a direct relationship, unmediated by the press, which is why Trump is such a keen, or was a keen Twitter user, where he has followers who just listen to him rather than having sort of boring media people saying, well, that's not true.
Thank you very much. Now, David, the microphone's coming.
David Haney, House of Lords. You started with a tantalizing suggestion. You might tell us how to best respond to this, but you didn't get there. Could you have a shot at that? And could you address, above all, I think you made a good case for the links between these strong men and the similarities between them. Does that mean that the response to them has to be a counter-strongman, single response, or should one be looking at responses that take into account the fact, for example, that China is a rising great power and Russia is a declining great power, that Bolsonaro is not a great power, and should one therefore be rather careful about ideas about a League of Democracies facing up to a League of Strongmen?
Well, I mean...
Hold on to the microphone.
I think maybe the answer I didn't give you the what to do thing is that I don't really have a very good answer to that, but I'll try to take a stab at it towards the end. But I think you're right. The whole League of Democracies thing is, it would be lovely, but it's you instantly get into complexities. I don't think it's a distinction that one should abandon. I do think it's important, but you look at the Ukraine crisis right now. Well, what do? We immediately rush off to Saudi Arabia, ask them to ramp up energy production. I think Blinken even went to see Maduro in Venezuela. So, you know, in the real world where one threat begins to seem more threatening than another, you instantly start making compromises. That, you know, you're a former diplomat, you know that better than I do. But I think that maybe I don't think the answer is to have our own version of strongmen versus theirs. I think it's to counterpoise our strong system against their, I think, fragile form of leadership. The strongman system doesn't work, I think, ultimately. It can work for a while, but it tends to work badly. And I think it can isolate countries, as we're seeing with Putin now, so that, again, the contrast between the unity of NATO and the EU, a lot of leaders, you may not necessarily know their names, they may not have the charisma of a Putin, but collectively, they actually currently seem to be in a stronger position than Russia. And so I think by showing that actually there is a strength in internationalism, in following agreed guidelines, international law, and so on, and that is our strength rather than the sort of charisma-led populists that are opposing you. But as I say, you're going to end up doing deals with some of them. I mean, everybody's rushing off to see Modi right now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jukka Siukusari, Ambassador of Finland. Excellent presentation, Gideon. Thank you for that. And I find great comfort in your words that the model will ultimately fail. But while we're waiting for that,
exactly.
What are the best means of democracies to defend themselves against strongmen? And have you been able to identify any characteristics of societies that make it more difficult? And one specific question on that, do you think bipartisan systems are more vulnerable to strongmen than multi-party systems?
Well, join NATO, obviously. And how's your neighbour, incidentally? Have you seen much of him?
The one in the West?
You're next door to the Russian ambassador, aren't you, in London?
Not too much, no.
Okay. But anyway, I don't know what the bipartisan systems are. I mean, I think that, you know, obviously the thing that's particularly worrying about the United States is if one party goes rogue, which I think the Republican Party has essentially done. What do you do about that? Because in any alternating system, they're going to get a phase. And one of the reasons that I probably shouldn't overdo the optimism is I think that the Democrats are going to lose the midterms, and it's quite possible, maybe even likely, that Trump will win again in 2024. Actually, one of his allies said to me, well, he sees it as three choices for 2024. He's either going to be dead, in prison, or president. Which is quite stark. But I think he thinks he's got quite a good shot at being president. So I think, you know, it's always tempting in these battles to either slip into despair or to say, okay, we've got them on the run, the victory is final. I suspect it's going to be a bit more of a pendulum, that you'll have moments like Putin doing very badly in Ukraine or Macron winning re-election where you think, okay, that's encouraging. And then there'll be blows as well. And the re-election of Trump, I think, would be very serious for the West. Because also I think that he would probably be radicalized in the second term. He wouldn't. He would start from where he left off, rather than where he was in when he came in. And sure, I mean, there are other places. I think a lot of people are quite concerned about what's going on in India and whether that's going to culminate in mass violence, or whether you're going to get a real step up in persecution of Muslims. At the moment, it's kind of rhetorically a bit worrying, and there's bad stuff going on, but it's not catastrophic. But I think that some of the more thoughtful people in the US, even, I mean, in the administration, even though they can see the strategic importance of India and are certainly determined to tie them into a sort of anti-China front, are concerned about the direction that country's heading in. So that could be one that could go wrong. And there are others. I think Bolsonaro will, well, actually the polls are closing, but Bolsonaro will probably lose, but will he accept the election result? Don't know. Same with Erdogan next year. If Erdogan were to be defeated and you were to have a decent opposition, and that would be a good moment, but a lot could go wrong. So, sorry, it's a bit of a sort of on the one hand, on the other, but it's hard to be definitive. It really is.
Thank you. A further virtual question from Sir David Madden. Thank you for an excellent presentation and debate. Is there not a distinction between strongmen operating in democracies and those who do not? Erdogan has lost local elections in the biggest Turkish cities, and his running of the economy is arguably the national crisis. And likewise, it says Johnson has contempt for principles and conventions, but he has to face the electorate.
Yeah, well, absolutely. No, I think that's very important. But I think that those of us who are in democracies and are having this kind of politics are in a much more fortunate situation than if you're in Russia or China. Everybody can see that Putin is messed up, but how you leave him out of power, who knows? But I think even in democracies, there is a risk to the democracy because strongmen don't tend to want to leave power voluntarily, and we saw that in the United States. Who could have believed that you would have events like the storming of the Capitol? And it was, to me, it was closer than we would have liked to have thought. Had some of the Georgia officials said what Trump wanted them to, if Pence had made a different call, you could have had a massive constitutional crisis there. And as I say, Erdogan is interesting. Yeah, he did lose elections in Turkey's in Istanbul, but he did have the election rerun, and then he lost again, and finally had to accept it. But we don't know whether, if he loses the presidential election, he'll go. And certainly, some Turkish friends of mine are not optimistic on that score. I guess if you're the opposition, you have to play it like it's a real election and hope that he does obey the rules. But yes, strong institutions are absolutely crucial. I think Israel was an interesting example when Netanyahu was close to Trump, very close to Trump, close to MBS, and Orban, in fact. And when he lost an election, started doing some of this, claiming it was the most fraudulent election in Israeli history and using some of the deep state rhetoric, but the system held just, and they got him out. He may be back, but if he comes back, it'll probably be through an election rather than through a sort of anti-constitutional coup.
Thank you. On my right.
Thank you very much. Martin Raven, ex-Foreign Office, including postings in Sao Paulo and Delhi.
Oh, okay.
You mentioned Mrs. Thatcher, and she believed in institutions. Where would you put Mrs. Gandhi in your list? And I think in terms of Bolsonaro, I think Brazil is very different from most of the other countries that you mentioned.
Well, I'll be interested to maybe I'll ask you to answer your own question because I suspect you might have a better stab at it than I will. But Look, Gandhi, obviously she did suspend Indian democracy for a while, and the resilience of the system, kicked in, and they got back to a more democratic system. I don't actually see much resistance in the current Indian system to what Modi is doing. I mean, maybe he hasn't actually suspended the constitution, though, to be fair. But he still seems to be winning local elections and so on. I mean, Indian friends are concerned about the independence of the media and about the independence of the courts and so on. But that's the kind of democratic erosion rather than the single kind of event where you declare a state of emergency and it's very clear what's going on. So I think that they're slightly different situations. Brazil, yeah, I mean, all these places are different from each other, but I think Brazil is an interesting example in the sense that it is a democracy, but it's a relatively, it's a fragile democracy. The military were in power till the mid-'80s, and Bolsonaro, I mean, one of the reasons that there's a kind of concern about him was his very ambivalent, or indeed, he praises the period of military rule as something one should look back to with pride and something Brazil should get back to. So at least the values of that period, not necessarily to military rule. And I think it'll be a major test for their institutions if he's certainly using Trumpian rhetoric in the sense that the way that Trump softened up the kind of public opinion before the last election by saying this election is going to be fraudulent, so that it was no surprise when he eventually said it's fraudulent. And Bolsonaro is doing the same right now. But it's a while since I've been there. People tell me that the military are sort of sending signals that they will not back him if he does that. So one hopes the system will hold, if he does that. He might be able to bring lots of people onto the streets, and you might get civil violence, and he's going up in the polls again as well. Brazil, I think, is a classic in the sense that it's such a polarized society that the two sides detest each other, and so you can create that sense of, well, it would be such a disaster for the country if Lula were to come back, and we know he's corrupt, et cetera, therefore it's legitimate to break the rules. I think deep polarization, which again is characteristic of the US, is really important in creating the sense that maybe we'll be mugs to play by the rules.
Thank you. Third row on the end. Yes, this gentleman. Thank you.
Thank you. Tony Klug, writer on the Middle East. Thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. You half anticipated my question, which was going to be where you fit Benjamin Netanyahu into your category in a multi-party system. And in contrast, I want to ask you where you would put President Sisi of Egypt in a one-party or effectively no-party system.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think Netanyahu, to me, he does fit in, because part of this is a sort of ideological movement, and who these guys' pals are tells you something. And the fact that he was close to Trump, close to Orban. He was one of two guests of honor, actually, at Bolsonaro's swearing in. The other was Orban. And so there was this sort of illiberal, anti-globalist, or anti-Soros is another hate figure for the Netanyahu family. There were definitely links. Now, there's always the question with these people, how far will they go? And I think the other thing is also that literally he presented himself as the kind of indispensable figure, the person who could go head-to-head with the other strongman leaders of the world. And I think in his last election campaign, they had big posters of him saying, in a league of his own, shaking hands with Trump, shaking hands with Putin. And yeah, he was an established global figure. He was somebody that people knew internationally as well as in Israel. But in the end, the system held, and he's also, he's on trial for corruption, as you know. So it's another object lesson in the need for strong institutions. Sisi, the same. I mean, you could have gone on and on. There were lots of people I thought, should I have him in? Should I? I mean, but I suppose I didn't put him in partly because autocracy is not that surprising in the Middle East, unfortunately. There's been a lot of it. So it's harder to make the argument that this was a sort of change. In a way, it's sort of going back to what had existed before the Arab Spring, although in a new and more brutal form. But you could certainly make a case for him being a figure who would be part of this phenomenon.
Thank you. Front row. Robin.
Robin Butler, House of Lords. I'm interested in your title, The Age of the Strongman. Is there something about our present times that particularly encourages the emergence of strongmen?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I touched upon some. I mean, I was slightly groping in the book because it's hard to pin it down, but I touched upon some of them earlier. I think that the rise in inequality, the sort of sense of cultural crisis around migration and so on. But it's also that I suppose maybe things move a bit in cycles, and there was this period of liberal triumphalism after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then there were crises and things went wrong. You had the Iraq War, I think, discredited American global leadership to some extent, and also probably opened up a rift between American elites and some of the public. That they. Then the financial crisis, the global financial crisis of 2008, I think, again, leads to a sense that, well, the liberal order is not everything it's cracked up to be. The people running it don't know what they're doing, and in a crisis look after their own interests. No bankers go to jail famously, but a lot of people lose their jobs. And so I think collectively you get a series of blows to the prestige of the sort of end of history liberal order, and the rise of people like Putin and Xi, who say, actually, it's not true that there's, as Thatcher said, there is no alternative. There is an alternative, and this is a different way of doing things. And for a while, they gather prestige. And maybe there's a sort of cycle in which sort of ideological trends do go in waves, because success encourages you to go further and further, and then perhaps to make a mistake. And maybe with the, I would say the kind of liberal 30 years starts probably with Thatcher in the West, with Thatcher and Reagan, and the reassertion of free market economics. And maybe it went a bit far, and that you deregulated too much, and then you have the financial crisis, and then you have a backlash. And you could argue that something similar is happening with the strongman period. For a while, it seems to answer a need. They have early successes, they gather prestige, and then they begin to, as Putin apparently does, believe their own publicity, push things too far, and they have a crack up. That could be one thing that's happening. Okay, we've got only one more question. Gentleman at the back.
Thank you very much. Recently, I was running a conference on peace building, and we had a panel on the...
Could you give your name first, please?
We had a panel on the importance...
Give your name, please.
Hugh Maitland-Jones, King's
Sure.
College London.
Sure.
A panel on the importance of narratives in peace building. Is the strength of strongmen due to their ability to put forward a coherent narrative, as opposed to a liberal system which might rely on institutions which rather struggle to put forward coherent narratives themselves? Is that it in a nutshell, or would you say it's down to something else?
I think that is an important part of it. I mean, certainly an emotionally appealing narrative. I don't think their narratives are necessarily coherent, often in sort of intellectually, in the sense that you can sort of pick holes in them. That liberals are quite good at that, saying, well, that's not quite really, and that's inconsistent. But if you want something to say, a very simplism is their thing. That their narratives tend to be very simple. They will say, there's something wrong, this is what we need to do, we can fix it quite easily if we just have the courage and we call it what it is. So that's, they're the masters of the three-word slogan. So Trump, build the wall. Yeah, I mean, America does have a problem with illegal migration, and you come up with this very simple thing: you just build a massive wall, and why won't the liberals do this when it's so obvious that that's what needs to be done? So they deal in very, very simple solutions. Take back control. It's a three-word slogan. Those kinds of things work, and they're emotionally appealing. And I think that invade Ukraine is a two-word slogan. It's a simple solution to a complex thing that's bothering people. And those kind of very simple narratives which appeal to dramatic action, strong action, appeal to people who are frustrated by the complexity of the world and would like somebody to come up and cut through it all and solve it for them. So I would say that they are all people who have coherent narratives because they're simple. They're not really coherent, but they sound coherent.
Thank you. My apologies to those who wanted to ask questions. We haven't had time, sadly. My thanks to you on behalf of us all, Gideon, both for your initial remarks and for your splendid responses to all the various questions that have been put. For those of you who've now heard the author, you can now read the book. And as I indicated earlier, if you do wish to, and I haven't been told where you're going to be signing books.
I'll sign them.
The more valuable ones may be the ones that haven't been signed.
Exactly,
but you never know. But this is how you go about it. So thank you very much, Gideon. And could I ask you all to join with me in thanking Gideon for his contribution.